Normalisation is part of the process of designing and creating database tables, but it's normally a part that causes students some considerable angst and upset. This presentation is designed to walk you through the typical normalisation problem that you'll face and show you how to approach this type of problem. So here's our typical normalisation problem. This is the sort that you'll find either in an assignment or in an exam. It would typically ask you to do four things. Firstly, identify all of the functional dependencies in the table. Secondly, identify what is the primary key of that table. Thirdly, it would ask you to determine what is the normal form of the table, and then finally you would need to describe why the table is in that particular normal form. So the problem is testing how you understand the process of normalisation. So here's our repayments table, the table we'll work with in this particular problem. So the first thing to do is have a good look at the structure of the table and the data. So look at the attributes and understand them, have a quick look at the data and see how it fits together. And that's our first step, just to get a feel for our data. The next step is we need to start by identifying the primary key. That's where I like to start, because with the primary key identified, you can then work out the dependencies. And remember that primary key has to uniquely identify every tuple in the relation. So here we have the following candidates for a primary key. We've got customer ID, because that will identify some relations, some tuples, receipt number, or a combination of customer ID and receipt number. So what is the primary key? But when we look at it, customer ID will not allow us to identify every tuple uniquely because, for example, there are two Z23s. So Z23, this customer Joe from Bathurst, has actually got two receipts. So customer ID is not going to do it. Receipt number will, because every receipt number is unique, and so therefore it will uniquely identify each tuple, and so is naturally a candidate key. Customer ID plus receipt number will also do the same thing. It will allow us to identify each tuple, and so is also a candidate key. So of these two candidate keys, which should be the primary key? Receipt number or customer ID plus receipt number? Normally I would go for the simplest solution, at least to start with. Therefore I'd use receipt number as the primary key in this particular case. So then we can start to look at the dependencies, and our dependencies are firstly receipt number, and notice I've done this not using the boxes that Robin Coronel liked to stress in the textbook. I've done this using set theory, and I've said the primary key here is receipt number inside a set of curly braces, and it determines an arrow, and then again in curly braces everything else in this table, because if it's the primary key, it's going to determine all of the other attributes in this table. So customer ID, amount received, customer name, customer address, receipt date. So we have this initial dependency. Everything is dependent on the primary key. But we can also see from our data that customer ID determines customer name and address. Now we know straight away that customer ID is not part of the primary key, so therefore it's not a partial dependency, so it must be a transitive dependency. That is something that is dependent but not part of the primary key, so therefore the table's got to be in second normal form. Wow, that kind of slipped past a bit quick, so let's have a look at how we do this. So we can now decompose this table to a customer table and a receipt table. So what is the normal form of the table? And this is the way we would go through it. And you step through the requirements one at a time. In order to be in first normal form, you need no repeating groups and identified primary key. We've got that. There aren't any repeating groups, and we have identified the primary key as receipt number. So second normal form needs us to be in first normal form plus have no partial dependencies, and a partial dependency is where attributes are dependent on part of the primary key. Here, receipt number and that attribute alone is the primary key, so we don't have any partial dependencies. Third normal form, however, requires us to be in second normal form and to have no transitive dependencies. And a transitive dependency is where an attribute is dependent on a non-key attribute. So in this case, customer address is dependent on customer ID. as is customer name. So that is a transitive dependency. So what form is our table? There aren't any repeating groups. We have an identified primary key. We don't have any partial dependencies. There are our dependencies. We've worked that out. We have 3 dependencies: receipt number, giving us determining customer ID, amount received, customer name, customer address, and receipt date. Customer ID determines customer name and customer address, and receipt number determines amount received and receipt date. So therefore, our table must be in second normal form. So our answers then to the problem would be, firstly, our 3 dependencies. Secondly, our primary key is receipt number. 3, our table is in second normal form. And then fourth part of the question, it's in second normal form because it has no repeating groups, an identified primary key, and no partial dependencies. And there it is. I mean, you can put it has a transitive dependency, and that indicates that it can't go on. But as long as you've got no repeating groups, identified primary key, and no partial dependencies, and saying it's in second normal form, you are correct. Now, sometimes you're going to be asked to go on a bit. And sometimes they'll say, now create an RDM for this to be in third normal form. So if that's the case, then what you need to do is basically put your foreign key in one table. Now, but which one? So normally the foreign key is on the table on the many side of the relationship. But here a customer can have one or many receipts, but each receipt can only be for one customer. So the receipt would be on the many side of the relationship, and it would hold customer ID as a foreign key. So basically we then take our dependencies and we put it into the RDM format. So in this case, table customer, in brackets, customer ID, customer name, customer address, close brackets, primary key, customer ID, semicolon. And for receipt, it would be table receipt, in brackets, receipt number, amount received, receipt date, customer ID, close the brackets, primary key, receipt number, foreign key, customer ID, references customer, semicolon. And that's the process. Go over this a couple of times if you're not quite sure of the process, but once you get a hold of it, it is a fairly simple process to complete.